Dr. J.W.A., theologist, thank you for coming by. Since 1994. Tickle versus Giggle, behavioural-constitutional analysis, episode 7, when the system started replacing conscience with compliance. The fluorescent carriage vibrates quietly through the underground tunnel while passengers stare downward into illuminated screens, avoiding eye contact with one another. Nobody appears physically restrained. Nobody appears openly terrified. Yet another physically, psychologically existential shift has now begun consolidating across Australian life. Citizens increasingly learning that conscience itself may no longer remain institutionally safe. That is where the Tickle versus Giggle conflict becomes civilisationally severe, because the deeper issue was never merely legal wording, policy disagreement, or administrative reinterpretation. The deeper issue was institutional systems progressively conditioning populations to subordinate internal moral recognition beneath externally approved behavioural compliance. And that is the authoritarian threshold most societies fail to recognise while entering it. The corporate employee privately disagrees but publicly affirms. The teacher internally hesitates but procedurally complies. The parent suppresses instinctive concern to avoid reputational danger around their own children. The university student learns immediately. Institutional survival increasingly depends not upon truthful conviction, but upon demonstrating ritual loyalty to administratively approved reality structures. And that repeated suppression changes human beings psychologically, because conscience cannot be continually violated without internal fragmentation, eventually emerging underneath the personality itself. At first, people merely remain quiet. Then they begin rehearsing speech. Eventually, they stop trusting their own recognition processes altogether. And that is how populations psychologically adapt to soft totalitarian systems, not through visible terror at first, through repeated behavioural submission against internal recognition, until compliance itself begins replacing conscience as the organising structure of public life. The train echoes mechanically overhead. Please remain mindful of community safety and respectful conduct. The language sounds harmless, and that is precisely why the atmosphere becomes dangerous. Because modern institutional authoritarianism increasingly operates through moral reframing rather than overt domination. Control becomes disguised as compassion, inclusion, safety, well-being, protection, and emotional care. Meanwhile, beneath the language, another process steadily advances. Institutional authority, progressively expanding beyond legitimate constitutional boundaries into psychological governance itself. And that expansion becomes catastrophic once systems begin implicitly teaching citizens internal conviction is dangerous, observable recognition is risky, conscience requires correction, and institutional affirmation matters more than truthful perception. And at that moment, power no longer merely regulates conduct, it begins reorganizing the moral structure of the population itself. And that's why the atmosphere increasingly feels spiritually disorientating in Australia, because the constitutional inheritance of Australia originally assumed Conscience possessed sacred protection. Truth existed beyond institutions. Reality constrained law, and human authority remained morally accountable beneath divine sovereign restraint above itself. But once institutional systems progressively disavow higher restraint, authority inevitably begins seeking deeper ownership over speech, recognition, perception, morality, conscience, and ultimately human identity itself. And that is the deeper, illegitimate sovereignty now bleeding underneath the modern institution condition. Not elected governance alone, administrative moral enthronement. The carriage slows again beneath flickering fluorescent light. Passengers remain motionless while government announcements continue speaking calmly through mechanical silence. Outside the rain-covered windows, the city still outwardly appears stable at least. But beneath the procedural continuity, another truth steadily consolidates. A civilization enters profound psychological danger once populations begin learning that institutional approval matters more for survival than conscience, recognition, or truth itself. Because once citizens are conditioned to betray internal recognition repeatedly enough for procedural safety, freedom no longer disappears dramatically. It dissolves behaviorally, quietly, incrementally, administratively, until eventually the population no longer requires visual coercion to maintain compliance. The fear of institutional consequence becomes sufficient to govern behaviour on its own. And that is where soft authoritarianism matures into something far darker than political disagreement alone. It becomes civilisational surrender of conscience itself.